Well, let's zero in on habit. It's not a bad thing that we're creatures of habit. We have to be creatures of habit. The world would fall apart if we didn't operate with habits. But because we get into the habit of operating on habits, when somebody asks us to do things differently, it just twists us into knots and terrifies us. So the terror is secondary to the fact that we're creatures of habits.
And lack of awareness about better possibilities?
I'm inclined to think that all of us are like the woman who wanted to become literate so that she wanted to see how far she could go. I think that all of us do have higher aspirations. So to me, that would be third. Habit, fear, lack of awareness.
Okay. John, you've been working tirelessly for almost 2 years to get the Ontario government to put some flesh on its poverty reduction plan. It hasn't done anything except equivocate and delay, as far as I can tell, for the last year and a half. What keeps you going?
Well, that's an interesting question. I generally don't just look to government and the government in power in terms of what they're going to do. And I try not to define myself, and I hope that others don't define themselves in terms of what governments may do or what opposition parties may say. I always think of the public and trying to make a good case to the public. And I'm not necessarily trying to convert anyone, but I think it's very, very important to make a connection to people. And if you can continue to connect to people about issues of poverty and be able to tell them that it's not about government taking money and paying it or providing a service to a particular person, but it's the whole idea of all of us contributing a way to all of civil society so that people are able to be raised up. So in other words, it's a connection to them to have a better society. And I think what happens is that we start to think too much about this whole issue of, well, there's people who are over there somewhere, they're not like us, who are poor, and our tax money needs to go to them. And when you have that sort of narrative, then you have governments that become very, very intransigent and start to think, well, we can't risk that. So what keeps you going, and what should keep you going, is the idea of thinking that you can develop the type of narrative that will connect to the public at large. And then in that connection, they will start to go back to government and say, we need to have this change. Because I think governments don't act until they hear that the public as a whole wants a particular regimen to be brought in.
And Judy, I'll wind up my portion of the questioning with you. Can you offer a couple of practical tips to people in the literacy field who have not engaged in advocacy before?
Well, I'm not, like others, I'm not an expert in literacy, but one thing I would say is to listen to the people that you serve. In other words, the people who are learning literacy are the people whose stories are going to tell you the most about what needs to be done. And also to work with them, because I think someone telling their own story is much more powerful than someone telling a story about someone else. And I think that where change happens most quickly is when someone in an authentic way can talk about how this change will affect them, would affect them or has affected them. So that's one thing that I feel very strongly about. And then the second thing is never take no for an answer. I mean, I think when I do advocacy workshops, that's the number one thing that always comes up, because I say, okay, you went to the school board and you said you had a great program and you presented to them, And they said, no, we don't have the resources. And inevitably in a workshop with people who aren't used to advocacy, you say, well, what would you do? And they go, I don't know, like my 2.5-year-old niece, no. And they never think, okay, well, where do you go next? Or how do you get around it? Or how do you change what the ask is? Or where can you get an ally? Or you never, ever accept no for an answer. That is the #1 rule for advocacy. Oh, thank you. It's one that's very hard for people to learn. People give up too easily when they're involved in advocacy. It's the biggest mistake that people who are new at advocacy do. So I say, you know, like I think Rick, I think said, you're all advocates already because you're teaching people. You're already agents of change, because you're helping to change people's lives by teaching them to read. And I think that you know, with someone, if you're teaching someone and they're not learning, you're going to find a different way to teach them. And it's the same thing. It's not different. Find another path. There's always another path. And you know, Carol said earlier, I've hit brick walls, and that's true. I have hit brick walls numerous times, but you can always find a crack in the wall somewhere. And sometimes, you know, you really have to push hard, but there's always a crack somewhere. It's never really totally, except for that fence down at there was no way through that fence, but I mean, they spent $5.5 million to build it for a weekend. So, you know, occasionally there's no way through, but not that often.
All right, I'm sure some of you have specific questions for our panelists. As I've pointed out, there are 2 floor microphones. It is important that you use them so everyone, and particularly the sign language interpreters, can hear you.
I was just wondering if you had advice for people who feel that potentially change is moving a little too slowly. I think that you had alluded earlier to bringing more of a youthful perspective into some of the advocacy situations that you've been in, and that's definitely one way. But if people of any age or of any demographic circumstances find that change is moving too slowly, how do you maintain that motivation? What can you do about that?
To me, again.
Do you want to start? Sure.
Yeah, sure, but you might have more experience than I do. Well, I think part of it is not to keep at the same thing over and over again. If you're finding that what you're doing isn't working, then to sit down and, you know, either through active listening or research or whatever way, to find a different way of doing it to keep up your motivation, right? Because, I mean, one of the problems is, and I've actually written a book about this, the book Transforming Power, which is basically saying, and this is addressing the left, you know, if what you're doing isn't working, and I think that is true during the last 10 years for the political left, then like you got to look at, you know, you have to re-examine what you're doing and figure out new ways of doing things that are going to work better. So I'd say that, and then the other thing is to analyze where the barriers are to change and why the change is so slow, and see if you can do something to help bring down those barriers. So those are the 2 things I would say.
I am guessing, Rick, that you have deadlines for your contract, so you have to make things work within a certain time frame.
You're right, and because of that, the starting point is always to really understand the perspective of the people we're asking to make the change. And the more that we can position the change as serving their needs, and the less we position it as something totally different from their priorities, the more powerful we will be in working with them. And the more intense, we work very, very hard to immerse them in their own, and the most inspiring thing about their own environment. So looking for the hottest possible inspiration is always a good idea.
Okay, and John.
Yeah, the one thing I would say, just as a tip, is try to look for milestones of various sorts. I can tell you once on the issue of social assistance rate increases For example, in Ontario, we didn't have one between 1993 and 2004. So if you were to say that, how many years that was, how much people had fallen behind, but then use a comparative such that, for example, old age security and the guaranteed income supplement for seniors, for example, is increased every quarter. So you could put out something in what you're writing that says, do you know that we've had 44 increases in old age security since we had the last increase of any time to a welfare payment? People would say, oh, I didn't know that. So if they're to look back in terms of key dates, see if you can establish those milestones, and then come up with a different story, type of story that someone's going to say, gee, I didn't know, do you know that we had fallen that far behind? That sort of thing. And those things can really be used to resonate with people. And it's just, I think, a trick of the trade.
Okay. Do we have, yes, have you got the little mic?
Yes.
Is it on? You need to push the button on the top.
Like that? How's that? That's
Great.
better.
Yeah.
Hello, Joan Roski from the Adult Learning Centre in Walkerton, Ontario. I wonder if I could ask John to specifically expand a little bit on the comment that you had at the very end of your PowerPoint there. You were talking about the good in your ask. And I just wondered if you could expand on that point. I have an idea of what you're talking about, but I think you might have a little bit more to say about that in terms of how we can make our ask more effective, and if you could.
Yes, what I was thinking about was the whole issue that, especially, it's something that happens on the left, but it happens generally speaking with all progressives, is they start to advocate for a means to an end without ever saying what the end is. For example, let's end global warming. For what? What are we trying to get to? That's a particular means to an end. Or we need an increase in benefits of some sort, or we need a lengthening in the sort of work that I do, that we need better rules in employment insurance, and we'll call for a shorter variable entrance requirement. That will be the clarion call. All of those things are means to an end, and when you're trying to engage with the public that does not necessarily know all the technical details of your particular area, you always have to be able to say, because we want a decent living for all people, or we want all people to be able to engage in opportunity, those could be good outcomes. But if you only, now you have to talk about means, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you don't do that. What I'm trying to say is don't get seduced by only talking about means to an end. Always look at whatever you're saying and ask yourself the question, what is the good of it? What is going to be that outcome for somebody? And then I think you have to have that as part of any of your ask or any of your change agent materials.
Does anybody want to add to that? I'm sure I'm not supposed to as an impartial moderator, but look around you for issues in the political environment that can link to what you're trying to achieve. At the moment, for instance, we have an unusually high rate of unemployment, and a lot of it is not going to go away, even if the promised recovery takes hold. There are jobs that are never coming back in the manufacturing sector and in many traditional industries. And the people who once held those jobs need new skills, need training, need basic literacy, which many of them didn't need to work in factories. And that's just one example. At almost any time, there is some external issue that's linked to yours. And so think of yourself in the context of the times and use those opportunities.